Now we're discussing all things related to health, and today's been an interesting day because India has, in fact, spoken out at the Quad summit, and not just that, countries at the Quad have, in fact, supported and heaped praises on India in terms of its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Democracy's work is what was said by US President Joe Biden today. We're here today to talk about the COVID-19 response of India. Yes, it faltered. Many mistakes were made. Mistakes that perhaps will haunt us forever. But there are lots of things that India did right as well, given the size of the country, given the population. And this is directly comparable to a country like China, similar in size in terms of its number of people. And the manner in which autocratic China has handled the pandemic 2.5 years on. That lockdown, the brutality continues. We'll talk about that as well. Dr. Swapnil Parekh is now joining us. Thank you so much for your time. Today, an immediate comparison was drawn between China and India as to how both of these countries have managed the pandemic. Even as we speak, there are videos from China, information, sketchy, yes, but we do have information about how brutal their lockdown is. The number of people who are being sent off to quarantine camps, babies as young as 3 days old are being put through RT-PCR test day after day. What is going wrong with China? The WHO has just made one statement saying that the zero COVID policy in China is not sustainable. Dr. Parekh.
Stan, these are very important questions, and I think perhaps the most important is the mindset, what the government is willing to inflict upon the people and what the people are willing to accept in China is very different from in most other countries in the modern world. Most of those policies are not compatible with human civilization and humanity as we know it. What could have been done better? Perhaps using better vaccines, vaccinating more widely in the populations that really need it. I think it's not very well known that vaccine coverage in the most vulnerable in the Chinese population, the elderly, isn't great, and they've used an inactivated vaccine, which is not as effective as some of the other options. So there are certainly some challenges that if there's a large number of infections, could lead to an overwhelmed healthcare system in China. But the impetus, the focus still seems to be almost exclusively on measures that have been implemented now, and vaccination still isn't being pushed as hard as it should be.
As a matter of fact, those above the age of 18 in China, only 50% of the population has got the first dose. So the elderly, the most vulnerable viewers, are not protected in China as opposed to India, Dr. Parekh, where the priority from day one, ever since the drive started on the 16th day of January in the year 2021, the focus has been on the vulnerable population. Of course, we started vaccinations for doctors and frontline workers first, and then came the seniors after the month of March. We've always focused on the vulnerable populations first, unlike China.
I think this is a strategy that many countries have taken. It's one that's been endorsed by the WHO. Even in India, we did see that there was a dramatic pickup in the desire to get vaccinated after the second wave.
Yes.
So we have seen that when the population is confronted with the devastation of COVID-19, then people do want to get vaccinated. And China largely has stayed better protected than many other countries from waves so far. And that may have led to a lower interest in getting vaccinated. It's also interesting that, if there is a government that enforces the nature of restrictions that we're seeing right now, the public may not have much trust in that government. So the messaging put out, they may not believe that the government is looking out for their best interests.
Yes,
that may be a reason.
Yes, in fact, I was coming to that a lot of people may have trust issues. That was an initial problem in India as well, but I think vaccine hesitancy was a problem that the government of India overcame fairly quickly. Would you not agree there are communication skills in terms of telling our people that, yes, this is the vaccine, it will not protect you completely, but it will protect you from severe disease, so you must come forward and take it. Building that trust is extremely important that India seems to have done. Look at the messaging. The Prime Minister went into Covaxin at a time when everybody had just nothing nice to say about Covaxin. Dr. Parekh.
I think in India, we have, to a certain degree, empowered the public health system to communicate with the public. And this has happened for decades in different states, different languages. For decades, there has been, starting with the polio vaccine campaigns, with MMR, and of course now with COVID-19, there has been a concerted push for decades by the public health system to build up a favorable opinion as regarding a critical tool like vaccines. And that has benefited us during the COVID-19 pandemic. I would say the baseline level of vaccine hesitancy is rather low in India. People have seen what infectious diseases can do. Polio is still fresh in our memory. Measles is still fresh in our memory. And contrary to other countries where we see people trying to avoid getting vaccinated, in India you will see people walk, both healthcare workers and people coming forward for vaccination, take great efforts to actually ensure that vaccines go into arms.
You know, Dr. Parekh, often when we talk about India's COVID-19 strategy, and we say that India has done a fairly good job given that just nobody knew what was coming. Of course, we were ill prepared for the second wave. Nobody's questioning that. We were overconfident and we did declare a premature victory over the pandemic, over COVID-19 towards the end of the first wave, I beg your pardon. But the fact of the matter is that we picked up from where we left it. We picked up the pieces, we learned along the way, and we knew that there were problems. And these problems had solutions, and we worked towards the solutions. Unlike a China, which ironically is going back to the old practices of locking down people, trying to ensure zero COVID policy, that no country in this world essentially is doing. Where has China learned then in the last 2.5 years, from when the first cases were reported in Wuhan up until today? We're almost 3 years into the pandemic.
I have great sympathy for what the people in China are enduring. And everyday people are much like us. They have the same hopes and aspirations. So it's very sad to see what they are enduring. There are strong criticisms of what the government in China is doing, both in terms of their failure to vaccinate as aggressively as they should have, and their policies right now. In India, to a certain extent, the challenges we faced during the pandemic, they weren't necessarily missteps only during the pandemic. Yes, we did make mistakes during the pandemic, but you have to understand that we as a country have not prioritized public health for decades. If we look back 3-4 decades, we have not done what needs to be done to scale out public health, to scale out primary health services, so that even the pre-pandemic needs of our population could be met. Yes, there are positive changes happening now. Yes, there were field hospitals. There were a lot of these jumbo centers set up during the pandemic. But it's very difficult to scale public health and pandemic response in a few weeks when we haven't scaled public health for the decades before the pandemic, and when we haven't prepared for the pandemic.
You know, Dr. Parekh, just 2 or 3 points, and do tell us a little about what you think India could have done right from timely procurement of vaccines to looking at its own interests first when it came to vaccinating its population just before the second wave. What were those 2 or 3 mistakes that we could have avoided?
I would say the most important, if you ask me, is in the decades before the pandemic. Just been better prepared for pandemics, known that an event like this was going to happen, and recognize that public health is such a critical component of wellness and happiness in a country. For decades, we should have been prioritizing it. During the pandemic itself, but I think before the second wave, we could have perhaps purchased, had much larger orders of vaccines that may have helped manufacturers scale a little faster. Perhaps we should have built a more integrated and more robust early warning system. So we should have had better genomic surveillance, better integration with clinical outcomes. So we would have known very much earlier and faster that we have a new variant, that it's more transmissible, more virulent, there's some degree of immune escape. And we didn't have that. by the time we recognized, a lot of the information we got about the Delta variant happened after it had hit the UK, and it had been spreading for months in India. If we had an early warning, perhaps policymakers would have reacted differently. Perhaps we wouldn't have been thinking that the worst of the pandemic is behind us if we were able to characterize Delta. And I think one critical thing that would have served us well, and we could have scaled something that Mumbai did well. We had the war room model that we used in India, and we had a number for citizens to call, for Mumbaikars to call when they had COVID-19 to seek direction. Where do I go now? What do I do now? There was telephone triage conducted to direct those patients who needed hospitalization towards hospitals. And so that our healthcare resources like oxygen and hospital beds that were, in could be optimized towards those who best needed it, most needed it.
Absolutely. Dr. Parikh, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, just before we started to have a conversation, that it's not like India has not made mistakes, several of them in fact, but the very fact that we've learned from our mistakes is evident in terms of our preparations that were visible before us for the third wave, in fact, that thankfully did not affect us like the way the second wave of the pandemic did. India has improved its vaccinations. More than 80% of the adolescent population has got the first dose of the vaccine, is what the government of India has just informed today. In fact, our focus continues to be on building on our strengths, which essentially is vaccination, and that is something that we've been looking at very closely. Dr. Parikh, thank you for your perspective. Thanking our viewers for connecting with us on that important story.